Welcome. You're listening to The Aligned Self, Conversations in Creating a Conscious and Abundant Life. This is Daniel Denovi. I'll be your guide and host. Let's see just where we can take this. Hello, friend, and welcome back to the conversation. I'm just on the end of my spiritual summit, The Spiritual Adventure, a gathering of saints where I interviewed a dozen different spiritual teachers, healers, psychics, to have them ascertain or share their spiritual journey. And one topic that came up more often than not was that of discernment, having the ability to discern a truth for you. As you are out in the world, out in the marketplace, how do you ascertain what things are most appropriate for you and what are not? Because we're also told not to judge. Thou shalt not judge. But a lot of people think that the lines between judgment and discernment are, it's kind of gray. So in this episode, I'm going to delineate, discuss, make distinct what discernment is and what it is not, and what is judgment, so that discernment becomes a tool in your toolbox. Put simply, a judgment is a decision that you arrive at based on past programming or your current knowing. And something that I've talked about in the past is that when people listen to new information, they typically do so from the position, do I agree with this or do I disagree with this? And put another way, we always want another way to look at things. Am I making this assessment based on my current knowing or my current understanding of the world? Discernment, on the other hand, is a considered decision, basically a judgment arrived at through consideration. And if we look at a slightly different definition of discernment, it might add some depth and breadth to the idea, and that is to make something distinct. We discern something from our environment. We separate it out so we have a working knowledge of it. You can think of judgment as a response, a knee-jerk response, and discernment as a considered response. For instance, in our Facebook group just today, I posted a picture that was put out by the Church of Unity, and it said the happiest people are the givers, not the takers. And on the original post, a lot of people were saying, yes, that's right, that 100% so true, and there was dozens of shares and hundreds of likes on it. But I shared it to the Aligned Self podcast group, and I said, I disagree. The happiest people can do both, if only slightly slanted on the giving side. Gratitude is the state of giving and receiving. It's time we stop vilifying receiving, don't you think? And so on the surface, this meme seems to make a lot of sense, but when I considered it on a deeper level, it was biased towards giving and vilifying. It was kind of the implied message that was there. In order for that to be true, then receiving also was not necessarily condoned as being admirable. I believe both are required. Obviously, if you're just a taker, that's not so nice. And if you are constantly taking from your friends, from your relationships, from different situations, you're going to find yourself on the short end of the friend list. But while this was just one example, in the marketplace, out in the world, in our culture, there's a lot of different statements that if you really sat down and thought about it, we accept at first glance. But if you think about it on a deeper level, maybe they're not that true. And so one question that I ask in my discerning, is this true across the board? Is it universal in nature? Or does it work across context from situation to situation? Is there a situation where it might not work or might not apply? And then also, if I find myself having an immediate response, an immediate aversion to accepting something, I have to ask, is this coming from a bias? Is this coming from my past programming? Why am I so opposed to this? Now, I do have a lot of questions that I ask in the process of discernment, but we'll try and make this as simple as possible. You're going to gather questions along the way that will make more sense and be more relevant to you. Now, do I dare consider the game of politics? Typically, we're on one side or the other, and historically, the general populace has navigated somewhere in the middle, so they can look at this side or that side and ascertain or discern Which topics or which issues deem my attention? Which do I consider important? And there might be issues on one side that have a lot of merit and issues on another, or an approach on the other side that also have a lot of merit. Now, one prevailing idea that's out there is that politics is a lot more polarizing today than it ever has been. And many of you would probably agree, and yet I have to ask the question, is that really true? Is politics today a polarizing topic? And I beg your permission to bear with me just a little bit. This isn't going to be all about politics, but I just want to make one more statement about this. And we need to consider the news. More so than any other time in history, our news is biased. We need to look at this historically, though, to really make sense of it. In the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the news outlets did a lot to try and present an unbiased position. They attempted, and not always successfully, to present all sides of the matter. So you could arrive at your own conclusion. But in the 1990s and the late 90s, Bill O'Reilly started his news commentary, his news edition. I think he was on Inside Edition for a while, then the O'Reilly Factor. The O'Reilly Factor show became the most popular news show in history. O'Reilly was one of the highest paid newscasters around, and why? He said it this way. He said, I realized that I could make a lot of money telling people what they wanted to hear. And because of his show's success, other networks began adopting a similar program where they would tell their listeners, whether conservative or liberal, what they wanted to hear. Tell the news, give the facts from a biased position. Because they're not dumb, they know that most people generally listen in order to agree or disagree with a point of view. They're not real thinkers. And so the news has done a lot to create separation in the marketplace, or let's say it's a separation in the discussion about what's going on in the world. And then, as of late, you have fact checkers, where information and different opinions are being pulled because they're considered to be erroneous. And who's doing the judging? Who's doing the discerning on this? That's the real question. It flies right in the face of the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights in America. And the First Amendment is not there to assure the facts are put out there. It's there to assure that everyone has a voice. Everyone has a point of view, whether it's relevant or not, whether it's factual or opinion. You see, the majority of the news that was occurring in 1776, 1780, and the 1800s was primarily opinion. They didn't have fact checkers. So you had to discern what was true and was not true. And that First Amendment really did fly in the face of what was practiced by King George at the time. Any speech that undermined the crown could result in imprisonment or hanging. And then supposedly in America, the government is of the people, for the people. The people have the final say. And I have to ask you, is that the climate today, or is it something else? I want you to use your own discernment. I apologize. I really didn't know I was going to go down this road because evidently I have an opinion about it. But, there's some questions that need to be asked that haven't been asked. So again, a judgment is a knee-jerk response from past conditioning, and a discernment is a decision arrived at through consideration. So I have a story of a young newlywed couple. They've been married 6 months, and it's coming up around Christmas time, and the wife was going to make Christmas dinner for her mom and her grandmother. It was going to be a generational Christmas. And so when the husband asked, what are we going to make for dinner? She said, what do you mean, we? I'm going to make a Christmas ham. We always make a Christmas ham. That's what you have at Christmas. And he said, okay. Well, she got the ham out and proceeded to hack off the end of it with a cleaver and put the ham in a pan and that little chunk that she cut off in a separate pan, also in the oven. The husband was slightly amused and asked her, why'd you cut the end of the ham off? And she looked at him rather incredulously and said, what do you mean? That's the way my mother did it, and the way her mother did it, that's the way you do it. And he made the mistake of responding, well, my mother never did it that way. She said, well, maybe she was doing it wrong. Well, knowing when to pick his battles, he decided to ask Mom and Grandmother when they showed up for dinner. And as soon as he could, he got Mom aside and asked, why do you cut the end of the ham off before you put it in the oven? She said, that's the way you do it. That's the way my mother did it. That's the way she taught me. And that's the way I taught my daughter to do it. That's the way you do it. And the young man replied, okay. Well, as soon as he could, he cornered Grandma and asked, Grandma, why do you cut the end of the ham off before you stick it in the oven? And she looked a little perplexed. Who told you you're supposed to cut the end of the ham off? And he said, your granddaughter and your daughter. They said, that's the way it's done. That's the way you taught them to do it. And then a light bulb went off, and it dawned on her where that came from. She said, oh my goodness, when I was first married, my roasting pan wasn't big enough for the ham that came from the butcher, so I'd have to cut the end off in order to fit it in the pan. And she laughed and said, I didn't get a new pan until my daughter had moved out and went to college. So she never saw me actually bake a ham without cutting the end off. And so I ask you, what behaviors, what beliefs do you have in place that you follow today that you've adopted along the way that might not be true, that if you were to actually begin questioning, where did they come from? How did you arrive at this? Who started it? Would it still stand the test of time? Does it work universally across context? I have another example of something like this as well. A friend of mine, when I was younger, was single and she had a cat. And I would go over and have dinner with her from time to time and just hang out. Well, somewhere along the way, her cat discovered that he could paw at the toilet paper and unravel the entire roll, because she had the roll hung in a way to where the paper flowed off the top of the roll instead of the bottom. And after one such event, she was shaking her head, saying, I don't know what I'm going to do. That cat keeps unrolling the entire roll of toilet paper onto the floor, and it's just not convenient to use when it's all bundled up. I, thinking the solution was rather straightforward, simply said, turn the roll around to where the paper, instead of flowing off the top of the roll, comes off the bottom. Well, she looked at me as if I had two heads, as if I was totally crazy, nuts. She said, you can't do that. You can't put a toilet paper roll on the wrong way. It's against the rules. And I said, watch me. And so I turned the toilet paper roll around, and then I pawed at it like the cat was doing, and it just spun around. The paper didn't unroll. And I responded to her, the only people that are going to know that you're breaking a rule, more than likely, is you, me, and the cat. The toilet paper police will never find out. She laughed and said, oh my God. I was just taught that there was a particular way you put the toilet paper on the roll. So I hope this settles arguments around the world. There is no right way to put the toilet paper on the roll. It really depends on how close the roll is to the person seated, on what's the most effective and most comfortable to get the paper off. It can vary depending on your setup in the bathroom. And I know some of you are saying, that's just wrong. That's just wrong. Well, this actually brings up a way of questioning. When we consider what is right or wrong, it implies a judgment. Just like my friend Sherry was doing, she was making a judgment about what was the most appropriate way to hang the toilet paper, and the cat was taking advantage of that. And so I asked the question, what is the most effective way to hang the toilet paper? Given the current circumstance, we are looking at effectiveness. When we look at rules, we need to ask, who made the rule? Why did they make the rule? What is the spirit of the rule? What is the intention of the rule? Is it more important to follow the spirit of the rule or the letter of the law? Was the letter of law created in order to save lives, or was it put in place to exact control? Is it a matter of opinion, or does it have historical fact? Now, when it comes to spiritual truth, discerning spiritual truth for yourself, there aren't as many facts to be found. Now, some people point to a particular book and say, this is the doctrine of this religion. This is what you're supposed to believe. Then again, who says? Who wrote it? Where did it come from? And then you also need to ask, does a document that was written nearly 2,000 years ago still have relevance today, given the changes in society, the changes in, does it apply to us today? Maybe, maybe not. Through my studies, I have found more inconsistencies than consistencies. And over the years, I've been exposed to 30 different Christian doctrines. I've also looked at Buddhism, Taoism, Hinduism, and Islam. I've also studied Greek mythology and Norse mythology. I've studied the works of Joseph Campbell in myth in general. And so even though I was brought up in the Christian church, my uncle was a Presbyterian minister, I read the Bible extensively when I was younger. And I even worked for a Christian-based organization that worked directly with churches, serviced churches. It was my studies of world religions, and probably more so my practice of meditation, that allowed me to discern certain truths, certain universal truths that were true across context around the world, to arrive at a definition of spirituality that was personal to me, a definition that I had discerned. And like I said before, there weren't and there aren't many facts around spirituality. A lot of it is based on faith. There's no objective truth to be found. And so to arrive at a truth, to arrive at an understanding, one that you discern for yourself, you're doing so independent of your previous programming. Now, you might consider your previous programming. You might even adopt it as whole and truthful. But without actually questioning it, without contemplating it, without taking a look at it from different points of view, and really ascertaining for yourself, discerning for yourself that it is true for you, and not just blindly accepting it, then you have arrived at a truth that you've discerned. And your ability to stand behind it and believe it wholeheartedly has the strength of steel behind it. Now, there's a couple quotes from Mark Twain that speak a lot to discernment. One is, if you don't read the newspaper, you're uninformed. If you read the newspaper, you're misinformed. The other quote I love is this: it ain't what you don't know that gets you in trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. One of the pursuits of the spiritual path is to take the unconscious and move it into consciousness. Conscious awareness, so you can actually choose it or reject it based on your discernment. Throughout our childhood, we've been programmed by culture, by society, by the authority figures in our life, our parents, our siblings, and our peers. And because we spend the majority of our time in our youth in an altered state of consciousness, a hypnagogic state of awareness, we are actually a sponge receiving everything around us because we're on the fast path to growth. Part of our adulthood is arriving at our own sense of self, our own sense of identity, our own sense of reality that we have discerned and become aware of independent of our past programming, one that you've chosen. Like you have a reality that you've chosen to participate in, not one that you're in by default. Well, that's it for this episode, my friend. I hope you've enjoyed this discussion on discernment, and I hope you begin questioning different aspects of your life, different aspects of your perception on whether or not you're operating from judgment from past programming, or have you arrived at a truth of discernment. Until next time, this is your friend and host, Daniel Danovi, urging you to follow your bliss, live your life from inner signals, be inner directed as you engage in the epic adventure.